Welcome back to another episode of Creedle. I am very aware of the fact that it's been a while since I did an episode of Creedle, but I'm really going to try to do weekly episodes here on out. So I've got a couple lined up, ready to go, and recording this one on November 11th. But like I said, hoping to do weekly episodes from here on out. And I have some potentially exciting news in the works if things come to fruition. So stay tuned for the next couple weeks, and hopefully I can announce some exciting changes coming up as well. No, this is something I just really get a lot of excitement out of, a lot of satisfaction from, and I really enjoy doing it. So I hope to be able to do it more frequently, and hopefully my schedule will permit that. So thanks for listening. It's a solo episode today. We're going to talk about the election. I did not do a pre-election one. I thought about doing it and just sort of ran out of time, but I wanted to do a discussion about how the Catholics should vote in this election. Didn't get around to that. So now I want to talk about how the Catholic responds to this election. I think there is certainly room for optimism. I think there's also room for sort of healthy skepticism. And we'll talk about those things. I also just want to talk about some of the macro trends in the political scene in America that contributed to the electoral outcome that we saw last week. So we'll get to all that. And I'm excited to dive in. All right. Without further ado, let's go. I think we start here with the failure of the media. I have three big things I want to talk about: the failure of the media, the failure of the Democrat establishment, and then I want to talk about sort of Trump's broad appeal. And then I have sort of three big picture takeaways for us as we reflect on the election as well. On this first point, the failure of the media. The media, since Trump's announcement of his first candidacy for president, has spent as much time as possible trying to reframe and put in as bad a light as possible everything the guy says. Now, if you're listening to this and you've listened to other episodes of mine in which I've mentioned or discussed Trump, you know that I'm no fan of Trump. I think that he is a narcissist. I think that he is famously intemperate. I think that he has many vices that make him a bad fit for the occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And I wish that he was not the president. Or maybe I should say, I wish that there was a different standard bearer of the Republican Party who could be president in his stead. I think that the worst of the Democrat Party have different excesses and different vices and very bad policy ideas. So I'm not saying that I wanted Kamala instead of Trump. I really just didn't like either of our choices. And I think I'm not alone. Well, I know I'm not alone in that regard. I think many of my friends are in that exact position that just said, really, this is the best that we can come up with. So I'm no fan of Trump. This is certainly not a MAGA podcast. So with that said, though, I think any objective analyst can look at what the media has said about Trump and how the media has framed everything that Trump has ever said or done since he announced his first candidacy and recognize that they are just notoriously dishonest. What they have told us, especially since January 6th, 2021, is that he is basically Orange Hitler, or maybe we can say Hitler with a hairpiece. And Hitler with the hairpiece is the one who's coming to destroy democracy. He's coming to take away women's rights. He's coming to execute transgender people. I literally just saw this, someone claiming this on Reddit today. He's coming to, tell you exactly what you can and cannot teach in your schools. He's coming to abolish the entirety of the federal government. If you're a federal employee, you're going to lose your job, et cetera. And that is just how the entire race has been framed. On top of him being a misogynist and a racist and a bigot and a homophobe and all, transphobe, all of these, insert the worst insults that the Democrat sort of left establishment can come up with. That's what Trump has been framed as. And obviously those portraits did not land. Now we're standing here on November 11th. Trump has, as of 2 days ago, the AP has officially called Arizona. And so Trump is now standing victorious with 312 electoral votes, and more importantly, for the sort of mandate to govern idea, a majority of the popular vote. This is very different from what obviously would happen 4 years ago, but even different from 2016 when he did not win the popular vote, but did win the Electoral College. So this is, Trump's now coming into power. He's ascended. He's stronger than ever, and he really believes that he has a mandate to govern. And I think that the stats, the election, really backs that up. So obviously, the media's failure to accurately portray Trump reflected poorly on them, and their attempts to frame him badly backfired spectacularly. And I can talk about a couple of examples here. One of the most prominent ones that's really just from the past 2 weeks is what they said about Trump's comment about Liz Cheney. Now, there's something very sort of delightfully ironic about Kamala ending her campaign with a listening tour with Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney, obviously the daughter of Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney, of course, one of the architects of the Iraq War and generally speaking, the entire neocon project of the second Bush administration, the W administration. And it's funny to me because in 2000 and 2008, Cheney was the arch villain of the Bush administration, and he was the arch enemy of the left, especially the anti-war left. And a lot of those feelings, at least until recently, still persisted because, I mean, even Christian Bale, who acts in the movie Vice, which is really a sort of a biopic about Dick Cheney. By the way, one of the most remarkable character transformations you'll ever see. When you watch that movie and you don't know it's Christian Bale, it's kind of hard to tell it's Christian Bale because he looks so different. But once you know it, you can see it in the eyes and the face. But Christian Bale, I forget exactly what the quote was, but he says something like he had the opportunity to play Satan in the movie Vice because he was playing Dick Cheney, right? So this is how vilified Dick Cheney was. And by the way, I don't think all of that's unjustified. I mean, I don't think Dick Cheney is a good man. But the hilarious thing is that, Liz Cheney's, certainly her foreign politics, do not stray very far from her father's. And now she's being heralded as, the hero of the Republican Party because she participated in the January 6th committee, one of a couple Republicans who did so that they could, fairly and accurately, if not misleadingly, label it a bipartisan commission, and has been a very, very vocal critic of Trump. Okay, so it's just funny to me that they end up sort of campaigning with a person they once said was Satan with his daughter to close out their campaign, and somehow think that's going to be a winning message with the new right, which is obviously very, very different from the 2008 kind of compassionate conservatism neocon right. And this new right really doesn't want any foreign wars, et cetera. So fascinating strategic choice that obviously didn't work. But it's funny because Liz Cheney has been very critical of Trump for a bunch of different reasons. And she's also very much in favor of continuing to give Ukraine assistance. And by the way, this is not a slanted source at all. This is from the government special inspector general for Operation Atlantic Resolve, basically overseeing the entirety of the Ukraine war assistance effort. We've given $174.2 billion to Ukraine as of June of this past year. It's even more now, but as of June of this past year, $174.2 billion. So this is a lot of money that's changed hands to Ukraine. The new right does not like this. The new right wants to wind this war down. It doesn't mean they love Putin necessarily. Maybe there are some who do, but it doesn't mean that necessarily. It means that they don't want to be spending hundreds of billions of dollars of American dollars, taxpayer money, going to foreign wars when we could be building infrastructure at home, improving lives for our own citizens, et cetera. Okay, I think that's a fairly fair position. Okay, but Liz Cheney wants to support Ukraine at all costs, and so Trump was talking about this, and he said that. Let me just read the exact quote, and then I'll read to you how this was framed. I'm reading, by the way, from a guy named Drew Holden on Twitter. He writes on a Substack called Holden Court. His name is Drew Holden, Holden. So you can follow his work at Drew Holden 360 on Twitter. But he talked about this, and he said this is one of the most dishonest narratives he's encountered in the media. Here's the Donald Trump quote. Trump was asked about Liz Cheney. And he said, well, I think it hurts Kamala a lot, actually, to be campaigning with Liz Cheney. Look, she's a deranged person, Cheney, but the reason she couldn't stand me is that she always wanted to go to war with people. I don't want to go to war. She wanted to go. She wanted to stay in Syria. I took them out. She wanted to stay in Iraq. I took them out. I mean, if it were up to her, we'd be in 50 different countries. She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle, standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it, when the guns are trained on her face. They're all war hawks when they're sitting in Washington in a nice building saying, oh, gee, well, let's send 10,000 troops right into the mouth of the enemy. Okay. That was the quote from Trump. Here's how the Washington Post covered that quote from Trump. He's obviously saying Liz Cheney wants to go to war. I don't think she would want to go to war if she was the one going to war. If she knew what it was to go to war and to have the rifles pointing at her, I don't think she'd be such a war hawk. And maybe she should try that so that she can understand what people actually go through when they're in war. That's clearly what he's saying. It's a reasonable position if made indelicately, but that's clearly what he's saying. Here's how the Washington Post framed it. Trump embraces violent rhetoric, suggests Liz Cheney should have guns trained on her face. Here's the New York Times. Trump assails Liz Cheney and imagines guns shooting at her. Okay. Here's CNN. Trump says war hawk Liz Cheney should be fired upon in escalation of violent rhetoric against his opponent. Here's a CNN chyron from Jim Acosta's show. Trump, Liz Cheney should be shot with guns trained on her face. Okay. This is so absurd. Here's The Guardian. Liz Cheney likens Trump to dictator after former president suggests she should face firing squad. Here's Roll Call. Trump advocates 9 barrels shooting at Liz Cheney. Here's The Atlantic. Trump suggests training guns on Liz Cheney's face. Here's Axios. Unrepentant Trump defends calls for war hawk Cheney to face gunfire. Politico. Trump was nearly assassinated. Now he imagines critic getting shot at. Daily Beast. The worst offender by far. Trump fantasizes about shooting female rival in the face. Does that even remotely reflect the truth of what Trump said there? Now, again, he might have been indelicate in his terms, but it's not ambiguous to anybody who listened to his comments in context to understand what he was saying. It was very clear what he was saying, and the media tries to frame it as he's basically calling for the assassination. Literally, Politico said, it was Politico, I think, said firing squad, right? No, I'm sorry. It was who's the firing squad candidate? Oh, it was The Guardian. The Guardian said firing squad. That is not at all what he was suggesting, and it's evident to anyone who listens. So this is an example of the media's terrible framing and just outright lying, certainly misleading comments and framing of narratives that simply backfired. I think some people buy it, sure, hook, line, and sinker, and that's why there are some people who do really are convinced that this is the end of their life as they know it. But a lot of people are smarter than that. And I think the media does not give people enough credit. The media assumed people would buy what they were selling, hook, line, and sinker, and that simply did not happen. That's the first failure. And there are many more examples that we could go into, but just for the sake of time, we're just going to talk about that one. There's a second failure, though, too. And this is really, this goes to the sort of raison d'etre of the media. Why does the media exist? The media exists to shine a light into dark places and to communicate and uncover and reveal truth. That is the mission of the media, or at least it should be the mission of the media. Now the media is actually just a mouthpiece of partisanship. And normally that manifests itself as being the mouthpiece of the Democrat left. Sometimes in the case of smaller outlets, it manifests itself in being the mouthpiece of the right. You can think about, outlets like the Federalists that are sort of reflexively pro-MAGA at every turn. But it's much more easy to think of almost any number of mainstream publications, Politico, Axios, certainly all the major networks, CNN, MSNBC, ABC, CBS, all of which are simply in the pocket of the Democrats and reflexively support everything the Democrats do and every single Democratic candidate for any political office anywhere. So we've really strayed from the original charter of the media. And I think it's terrible. It's terrible for the health of democracy. It's terrible for civic participation. It's terrible for having an informed electorate, because we don't actually know what truth is, because we have no institution that we can rely on to actually tell us true things. Ironically, the ones who are most successful now are the ones like Joe Rogan, the sort of new media entities that do not neatly fit a partisan divide, but are simply committed to having interesting conversations, especially with people with whom they disagree. And I have a lot of respect for that. Do I agree with Joe Rogan on everything? I mean, honestly, I've listened to like 5 episodes of his podcast total, so I don't really have a great sense of his political ideology. But from what I've read, I disagree with him on an awful lot. But I respect the fact that he has people on his show to talk about things, even when he disagrees. And we need to do more of that and have a genuine, humble, epistemically humble attitude of finding out what is true. When we don't do that, we really injure ourselves. And there's a clear example of this in the sort of in the storyline of how this election came to be, especially for the Democrats. Obviously, Biden announced long ago that he was going to seek a second term. It was evident to many people, if not most people, who have 2 eyes, that Biden was not up to the task physically or cognitively. He's been slipping for a long time, and this was, again, very evident to anyone who had 2 eyes. But the media apparatus went into full-scale spin mode to try to tell us that our eyes were the ones that were deceiving us. It wasn't that Biden was cognitively not up to the task. It was just that we were falling prey to what Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, said was cheap fakes, right? Don't fall for the cheap fakes. I mean, she literally used this word and said there's a barrage of cheap fakes on social media. And this was about a week before the debate, when it was evident to everyone, even Biden's most ardent supporters, that he was not up to the task of a second term. So there was a quote from Karine Jean-Pierre where she basically said Biden is sharper than ever. There was a CNN interview of Jared Bernstein, who's one of Biden's economic advisors, who also was insisting that Biden was sharper than ever. There was a famous line from Joe Scarborough in which he said, this version of Biden is basically more coherent than ever. I forget the exact terminology that he used. And it was just embarrassing for everyone who was towing the party line that way. When it was obvious to the American people in that presidential debate between Biden and Trump that Biden was not all there, when that became obvious and no longer something that was able to be hidden from the American people, it, I think, really was a black mark on the entire establishment. Number one, for covering it up, the Democratic establishment, but two, on the media for not even asking questions. There are very few exceptions on this. Alex Thompson at Politico was one who was sort of sounding the alarm about Biden's health for some time. But the vast majority of people were not interested in asking this question and were not interested in following up. And by the way, that was back in June. I think it was June, right? June or July? June. That was way back then. And since then, it's not really clear who's running the country. I mean, we have a president who clearly is not cognitively up to the task. We had a vice president who was just hitting the campaign trail, clearly not actually running the country. So it's unclear who's doing what and why things are still at work. Now we have a very robust, for good or ill, bureaucracy that can keep the machinery in motion, but it's not clear who's making the decisions. I assume it's our vast numbers of unelected bureaucrats. One more example of this sort of media framing that you might find humorous is this clip from a CBS anchor, and I'm going to play a little bit for you here. But you can check out this clip and see exactly what I'm talking about. The context is, of course, in Trump's Madison Square Garden rally, he had a insult comedian, a roast comedian, come up. I think the guy's name is Tony Hinchcliffe, and Tony made a joke about Puerto Rico. It was not a good joke. I mean, I think in general, the sort of insult comic shtick is strange, and I don't find it very funny in most instances. But this one, I think in particular, was just a strategically bad choice to make at a campaign rally of all sorts when you're trying to support a candidate for elected office, and you have this kind of has a microscope on him the entire time. So we made this joke about Puerto Rico being like a floating island of garbage or something like that. And then, of course, the media tried to run with this and just associate him as closely as possible with the Trump campaign, even though there is no association with the Trump campaign. He was just at a campaign event as one of sort of the undercard guys. But it was trying to just spin this into something. And then during Kamala Harris's sort of closing argument speech right outside the White House, on the White House lawn in the Ellipse, Biden went on a Zoom interview and said, the only garbage I see out there are his Trump supporters. And which was just a hilarious blunder, and one actually does wonder if Biden didn't want Harris to win after all. But I digress. This was all the backdrop to what you're about to see and hear from CBS.
As we are now 6 days out from Election Day, nearly 60 million votes have already been cast in early in-person voting and through the mail. And the latest polls suggest the race could not be tighter. Both campaigns are locking their focus on the battleground states. Vice President Kamala Harris rallied in North Carolina and Pennsylvania today and is in Wisconsin tonight. Former President Donald Trump was in North Carolina earlier and tonight is also in Wisconsin. He landed in Green Bay just a short time ago and then pulled this campaign stunt, speaking to reporters from a garbage truck, proof that he and his supporters are giving no grace to a gaffe by President Biden, where he, in his explanation, inadvertently called Trump supporters garbage. This, of course, was in response to that racist joke about floating garbage told at a Trump rally just last weekend. Vice President Harris is distancing herself from the negativity and trying to drive home her unifying message that if elected, she will represent all Americans.
So this is, again, an example of just insane framing. And I think people are honestly smarter than this. Some people certainly fall for it, but I think they're smarter than this. I also think of the framing of J.D. Vance as weird. Tim Walz, the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats, was especially gleeful about calling J.D. Vance weird, especially in the early days of the campaign. But the media was trying to convince us that Trump has elected this just really bizarre, out of touch, potentially even suspicious candidate who was just weird. And that was the word they like to use. They'd like to call J.D. Vance weird. Well, NBC exit polling shows from last Tuesday shows that Trump actually, or that Vance actually had the highest favorability ratings of any of the four candidates who were at the top of the tickets. He ended up being a very relatable, common sense, middle America kind of guy who had a great affect in interviews and who people really related to. And so again, the media spin just absolutely failed. The problem with trying to lie to someone once is that as soon as they find out you lied to them, they're not going to trust you again, or at least it's going to be very hard to earn their trust again. And this is the situation in which the media have found themselves. And the more desperate they became as polls continue to look good for Trump and bad for Harris, the greater and the more ridiculous and the more fantastical their lies became, and the greater they injure their own credibility. And it's going to be a long, long time before they get their credibility back. Now, there's one sense in which I'm happy about that, because I think the sort of corrupt, embedded institutional media players need to have their credibility in tatters to learn a lesson, because they won't otherwise. But there's a part of that that makes me deeply sad, because this is a country that really has a long and storied history, not just of the press, but of the freedom of the press. The press has a storied history precisely because of our constitutional freedoms. And instead, in all of our decadence and all of our excesses, we've translated that freedom of the press into not an empowering freedom to go dare to do greatness, to be greatness, but actually a license to do the worst that we can do and use the media and exploit the media systems that we have at our disposal for corrupt ends and for telling untruth. And I think that's really sad. And I hope we can stop doing that. Okay. So that's a big thing. Failure of the media. That's the first big thing. The second big thing, the failure of the Democratic Party. This one's really interesting. And if I were a registered Democrat, I would be really disappointed about my party right now, because this party is one that for 4 years has labeled their main opponent, Trump, the enemy of democracy. But in the 11th hour, it was the Democratic Party that actually staged a palace coup to replace their democratically chosen and selected candidate with one who no one had voted for, right? With Kamala Harris. So this is certainly a failure of them to, again, working with the media, a failure of the Democratic Party to identify early on and at the outset that, hey, our candidate is not up to 4 more years. They should have done that long ago. But then when it became painfully obvious to every single person that Biden couldn't do it, they should have done something more democratic than a completely undemocratic process of just nominating the successor. We do not have a constitutional monarchy. We have a democratic republic. We elect our leaders. And so the fact that Biden could simultaneously announce his refusal to seek another term and also essentially handpick his successor was crazy. And obviously there's stuff going on behind the scenes. Famously, the Bidens and the Harrises don't get along. So I don't actually think Biden really wanted Harris to win at all. But obviously he had to nominate her because of various machinations going on behind the scenes. But the fact that they did this palace coup and then could parade this candidate in front of everyone and say with a straight face, their candidate is an enemy to democracy and a threat to the democratic process and our ideals and our norms, was ridiculous. That message clearly did not land with the American people. And I think it's a very reasonable thing. It's very reasonable to understand why it did not. So this is bad. On top of that, I don't know why the machinations happened to anoint her, I should say, as the sort of standard bearer of the Democratic Party, but it ended up being a just historically bad choice for the Democrats. This election wasn't a blowout win, right? This is not Reagan versus Mondale. I think Trump, I would say he has had a comfortable win in the popular vote, obviously, and a comfortable win in the Electoral College. But if you narrow that down to a few swing states where the difference is, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of votes, it's not a blowout at all. It's actually a pretty close election. And so there's a world, I think, certainly, in which the Democrats actually run with a better candidate who can better connect with swing voters, who can better connect with independents, who can better convey Democratic talking points, or at least avoid the really controversial talking points with general audiences. and critique the current administration, the Biden administration, in gentle ways, but in ways that are honest and truthful. There's a world in which the Democrats do that and they win this election. Instead, they put on the stage a candidate who has literally never won a vote at the national level. Recall, she ran she ran in the primary previously, and famously accused Biden of being a segregationist and a racist in the debate, but she dropped out before the first election, the first caucus in Iowa, because she had no traction. No one was supporting her at all, so she dropped out. I mean, that's what her political skills got her before. And so the problem is that they went with her anyway. On top of that, though, on top of her lack of electoral experience, she's just a weak candidate on policy. I mean, the Republicans were able to very effectively, I think, attack her record on the border, right, when she was appointed the border czar. And of course, mainstream media said she was appointed the border czar, but then when Axios did this, especially, they were caught red-handed doing this. They had articles calling her the border czar, and then when the Republicans started to point out she was the border czar back in June, they were articles about this. Axios said, no, she was never the border czar. And then people had to drag up the Axios articles, which were then I think they were retroactively edited. But it was crazy. She, regardless of the exact title, she had a responsibility to work with the trilateral group of countries who were most responsible for the migrant crisis. So she had a heavy involvement in the border, which has been, of course, Biden's signature policy failure. On top of that, he also gave her, and most people don't know this, but he also gave her responsibility for this massive urban or rural internet infrastructure plan that was designed to connect rural households all across America to broadband internet speeds. They've spent $42 billion in that project. It's been going for over 1,000 days, and they have yet to connect a single household. Right, so this is the kind of policy success that Harris has. I also think of her interviews, and these interviews were just cringeworthy levels, sort of cringe Hall of Fame levels of bad. She was asked very recently, I think this 3 or 4 weeks ago, on The View. Sonny Hostin asked her, when you look at the Biden administration, is there anything that you would have done differently? And let's just take a listen to this exchange.
Well, if anything, would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind in terms of, and I've been a part of most of the decisions that have had impact.
I mean, that is absolutely crazy to me that you can say that. You can be the incumbent vice president running for election for president for an electorate that clearly desires change, and then not be prepared for this very basic question of what would you do differently if you could have a mulligan in the last 4 years. That is crazy to me. She says it's not a thing that comes to mind. And this to me just speaks to the absolute weakness of Kamala as a candidate. So that's another big takeaway. I think that Douthit had a good column this past Sunday in the New York Times where he talked about this sort of reckoning for the Democrats and the foreseeability of this. And he says this. He says the delay to replace Biden on the ticket was fatal because of another foreseeability. That Kamala Harris, notwithstanding Brat Summer, we don't even need to talk about Brat Summer. Oh my goodness, don't even get me started. And the politics of joy and all the other weird effusions that accompanied her sudden ascent to the nomination, was just not the candidate that a political party would put up if it took its own rhetoric about the existential stakes of the election seriously. That's exactly right. If the Democrats truly believed that democracy, the very fabric of our nation, was at stake, they would not have put up Kamala Harris, who, to my memory, I haven't been around since the beginning of the Republic, but to my memory, this is the worst national candidate I have ever encountered in my life. Just shockingly, embarrassingly bad for the Democrats. Okay, that's the second big takeaway, the failure of the Democratic Party. The third takeaway, Trump's broad appeal on the issues. I think this is, it's not rocket science as to why he won. I think basically he has broad appeal. The assassination attempt obviously helps him. He has that iconic image of himself with blood streaming down his face from his ear, holding his fist to the air as he says, fight, fight, fight. And the American flag is waving behind him, and the Secret Service folks around him are mobbing him. I mean, this is a crazy, crazy image. And he has that appeal as a fighter to his base. He's now the second president after Grover Cleveland to have a second term discontinuous with the first. So Grover Cleveland's no longer the only president to ever do that. So he's a winner as well. And I think people see him as a fighter. People see him as a winner. He's obviously vague on policies, but the policies that he espouses are very protectionist. And they are, I mean, his agenda is called America First because he really prioritizes that in his rhetoric. So he talks about tariffs because he wants to protect American industry. He talks about immigration because he wants to protect American workers. And so it's really not rocket science as to how he succeeds. You know, and his actual business successes or failures aside, he is perceived as a successful business tycoon. And so people think, who can fix this bad economy? It's got to be a businessman. We need a businessman in there. So this is really, again, not rocket science to understand why Trump has such broad appeal. I think there's also something here about the sort of shift to independence, though. The failure of legacy media has shifted power to people like Joe Rogan, people like Theo Vaughn, and Trump did the podcast circuit quite a bit. He was on a lot of these podcasts, especially that speak to young men. And I think it really served him well in an electoral sense because people heard a candidate who could be open and honest and transparent and tell interesting stories and tell jokes and be friendly with guests. And they would listen to him, for example, on Joe Rogan, and he makes interesting points, even if Joe Rogan disagrees here and there. But you don't come away from that thinking this is Hitler with a hairpiece. You come away from that thinking like, this guy is kind of funny. He clearly has charming stories. He reminds me of my grandpa, you know, and that outcome is very devastating for the Democratic perspective because the Democratic perspective was never this guy has bad policy ideas. The perspective was always this guy is dangerous for America and will kill us all, right? And that narrative does not at all square with the appearances that Trump is doing on all these podcasts and the interesting conversations he's having with various hosts around the country. So I think that's the other thing I would say on that. And then finally, there's the proven record. Trump has a proven record in the sense that he was already in the seat for 4 years. And at the end of the day, you're an independent, undecided swing voter. The most salient thing that you can ask yourself as far as the national election relates to your life is, was I better off after 4 years of a Trump presidency or after 3 3/4 years of a Biden-Harris presidency? If the answer is I was better off under the Trump presidency, you're going to be inclined towards Trump. You're going to be inclined to disregard the Hitler with the hairpiece stuff. You'll probably even be disinclined to regard the January 6th stuff because, again, the media overplays their hand. They've been shrieking nonstop about Hitler with the hairpiece. They've been shrieking that he wanted Liz Cheney to face a firing squad. And then you start to wonder, what else have they lied about? Was I lied to about all the other things that Trump was involved in that I previously thought made him Hitler with the hairpiece? And so you're inclined to vote for him. So this is really, again, it's not rocket science. I think all of this makes sense as to why an undecided independent swing voter would, on the day of the election, wake up and think, you know what? Honestly, I got to vote for Trump. Now, there's one more thing here, which is the failure of polling, right? All the polling up to the election said that basically this is an absolute neck and neck tie. I think it was Nate Silver, the famous pollster, who on the morning of the election said, "Good morning. We've run the simulation 80,000 times." He did this, his Monte Carlo statistical simulation. We've run it 80,000 times, and Harris won 40,000 12 times. Okay. Now that obviously means that Trump won 39,988 times, but the point is not that it's basically a coin flip, which was Silver's point. My point is that this outcome did not look like a coin flip outcome to me. It wasn't a blowout, like I said, but it wasn't a coin flip either. The reality is that polling, again, undercounted Trump support. Now, pollsters thought they had fixed that. They did that famously in 2016. They vastly undercounted Trump support, so they thought it was going to be a Hillary Clinton blowout. Ended up being a commanding Trump victory, but still lost the popular vote. They were supposed to correct for that. They've been working on this a lot. How can we correct for this sort of silent Trump voter? The problem is, right, when you have a media ecosystem that has just perpetuated this thing that Trump is Hitler with a hairpiece, people literally face losing their jobs, losing friends, losing relationships with family members if they say, I'm a Trump voter. So it's much more common, I think, I would suspect, and much more common for people to say privately, I'm not going to vote for Trump. And then they get into the privacy of the ballot box and they think, goodness, I got to vote for Trump because Harris is terrible. And the Democrats have been doing nothing but destruction for the last 3.5 years. There was this Kamala ad in the final weeks of the election that was basically encouraging women to vote for Harris, even though their husbands wanted them to vote for Trump. And so the ad setup was basically, there was this obviously a flyover state rural couple because he seemed like a farmer and had a MAGA hat and stuff. They're going to the polls. And he walks in with his wife and he says, like, all right, honey, your turn to vote. Make sure you vote for the right person, And then she goes into the ballot box, and across from her is another woman, and they make eye contact, and then they both indicate they're voting for Harris, because it's almost like, we live in Handmaid's Tale, but in the ballot box, my husband doesn't see my vote, so I can get away with it. And it's like, wow, like, girl boss, the resistance, nevertheless, she persisted kind of ridiculous drama. And so they vote for Harris and they walk out, and then the husband's like, did you vote for the right candidate, honey? And she's like, you know I did. And so the idea was like, oh, we're going to like ride on the reproductive freedom, reproductive health issues entirely. And we're going to get all these women who would otherwise be Trump voters and who are married to Trump voters to actually just vote for Harris, because they really, 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 really care about killing babies. And I think what's actually more likely is the opposite, that there were a lot of people who externally had to say they were Harris voters. And maybe this is not a lot, right? But there's some subset of people who externally have to say they're Harris voters. And to their friends, they signal Harris voters. They might even wear the Harris Walls stuff. And then they vote for Trump because they recognize, like, this is all just a giant ruse. Like, I have to go along with it to save my job, to save my friendships, but this is all a giant ruse. I'm sick of it. We had 3.5 years of Biden. It did nothing for us. We had 4 years of Trump. They might call him Hitler with a hairpiece, but he's really just like a bombastic real estate guy who's annoying and a little bit of a drama queen, but he did better for us. And I think that's more likely, that we had more silent voters like that. So there really is this sort of, the silent Trump voter persisted. I think they sort of changed in makeup a little bit. But I think that really persisted. Okay. So this episode is going on a bit longer than I intended. So let me just really quick talk about a couple things. One, I think things will get worse before they get better. These are the sort of three takeaways. Things will get worse before they get better. Now, I think there's room to be cautiously optimistic. I think there are a lot of things on the Trump policy agenda that could work well and that I like. But I think things will get worse before they get better. I mean, why do I say that? One, we are very, very polarized right now. And, things are always most unstable in periods of transition. We have a giant period of transition now. And because of that, we have an inherent period of instability right now. And I think that is obviously a moment that is ripe for crisis and ripe for opportunity at the same time. So that's one example. The other example is tariffs, right? Trump has come to office on a pro-tariff policy. And there's a couple things to note about tariffs, right? Many people, like Ben Shapiro, for example, who have been Trump supporters this time around, are not friends to tariffs at all, right? Because tariffs often have trickle-down effects that can be pretty, devastating, at least in the short term. Basically, the way tariffs work, right? We're importing goods, let's say from China, right? We're importing battery chargers from China. And we put a tariff on battery chargers. So now China has to spend 30% more to ship their battery chargers to us, right? What happens in the short term is those costs get passed on to the consumer. So you actually can see an increase in prices when tariffs are applied. What happens in the longer term is one of two things. Hopefully, this is the pro-tariff argument. The short term happens one of two things. One, either China gives us whatever concessions we want through the tariffs, and it's very clear, by the way, that Trump, when he talks about tariffs, Trump is talking about tariffs as a bargaining chip, not as a steady state way of being. So you're using tariffs as ways to extract strategic concessions or economic concessions from our trading partners. So option one is China gives some concessions, right, to eliminate the tariffs, but to give us what we want or are asking for. And option two is that because the battery chargers are now that much more expensive coming from China, American entrepreneurs think, well, hold on, we can make those here. Let's do that. We're going to start making our own battery chargers, and then they can make them, American made. We're no longer reliant on China for all of our iPhone chargers, and we can get them in America at prices hopefully comparable to what we were paying before the tariffs were even applied. And now we've revitalized the American industrial base. Okay, so that's basically the argument there. But even in the best case scenario for tariffs working, I think things get worse before they get better. So that's one example of how I think this sort of period of transition can lead to instability and potentially worse outcomes in the short term. And now, obviously, long term, like tariffs might just fail miserably. Like maybe it's hard to make the chargers because we don't have the materials to do that. And maybe the tariffs are improperly applied or sloppily applied. So we're actually, putting tariffs on the exact the precious metals that we need to put in the wires that we use to make the chargers, et cetera. So there are a bunch of ways this can go wrong, and tariffs are in generally a delicate and dicey proposition. So I'm not saying they're going to work for sure, but I think even in the best case scenario, things get worse before they get better. Okay, second, conservatism is not dead, but it is in peril from the right. Now, I think this is really important, and I don't want to spend too much time on this. I'll probably do a longer episode in the future, and probably several episodes, honestly. This is probably going to be a long-running theme when I talk about things. But I'm fundamentally a political conservative. I think that political conservatism has the best arguments for its favor. And there are some ways in which the Trump agenda lines up with political conservatism, and there are other ways where it does not. But what I'm really concerned about is the supporters of Trump who are self-identified conservatives, but are really not conservative, constitutionally, or in affect at all. And I'm deeply concerned about the new right being co-opted by people like the anti-Semitic groypers who like to just post anti-Semitic memes all over social media or accuse the Jews of running the world nefariously, or the Andrew Tate sort of manosphere types who speak and speak terrible things about women and treat women terribly. And Andrew Tate and his brother's case have been accused of being involved in sex trafficking. Those people are really becoming prominent on the right, or even the potentially is initially seen as more anodyne, more harmless, but the sort of like Elon Musk tech bros on the right who just they're not interested. They're certainly not social conservatives. They're not interested in traditional families. They are instead interested in reducing regulations as much as possible so that we can become accelerationists and accelerate technological development as much as possible. Now, I like technological development. I like technological progress. I think all of it has to be properly situated in a metaphysical sphere and has to be properly ordered towards the development and the betterment of humanity, not just a sort of inexorable progress of humanity and building our own Tower of Babel. And so I'm worried about that as well. So those are, I think, sort of the three angles of attack within conservatism that I'm most concerned about. And this leads to the third point. Our hope is never in political salvation. So if you're listening to this and you're really devastated that Kamala lost, that's okay. I have news for you. Our hope is not in politics. If you are listening to this and you are overjoyed that Trump won, that's okay, but I would caution you, our hope is not in politics. So do not place your hope in princes, as the scriptures tell us. Our political salvation does not come from people of this world. Our salvation ultimately comes from Jesus Christ. And there is going to be a time in every serious Christian's life in which we find ourselves to be strangers in a strange land. And we don't neatly fit into either of the partisan political divides in our bimodal context, or in any of the partisan political divides if you're in a situation where you have multiple political parties. To be a Christian is to be other than. It is to be set apart. It is to recognize that there is an Eden, there is a New Jerusalem to which we are all going. And until we get there, there will never be perfection on this side of the veil. And so our salvation does not come from politics. Our salvation cannot come from politics. Our salvation comes from Christ alone, who is the true King. So we'll talk about that. It'll be a consistent through line of all of my political analysis. But there we go. There's my thoughts on the election and sort of how we move forward from here and what happens next. So that's it. I would love to hear your thoughts. Please send me a note, zach@creedalpodcast.com. Let me know what your thoughts are on the election. You can let me know who you voted for or how you thought about voting. You can let me know if you disagree or agree with anything that I said in my analysis and my discussion of things. Would love to hear from you. So please send me a note, zach@creedalpodcast.com. I'll be back next week. I think we'll talk with Larry Chapp about the synod on synodality. So that should be an interesting conversation. But until next time, God bless you.